They say the most dangerous seeds are the ones you don't notice being planted. Um, for me, it wasn't a dramatic revelation or a sudden jolt of awareness. It was quieter than that, softer, like a whisper in a crowded room, just loud enough to catch my ear, but easy to ignore at first. My name is Emma, and I was, for most of my adult life, a woman who prided herself on being content with my life, my choices, and most importantly, my marriage. David and I had been together for 10 years, and while our relationship wasn't the fiery, passionate kind you read about in romance novels, it was good, steady, comfortable. David was an average man in every sense of the word. He was average height with average looks and a mild disposition that made him easy to love, but hard to idolize. In the bedroom, he was adequate. I never thought much about it. To me, love was about connection, partnership, and mutual respect. I had always told myself that physical attributes were just a shallow distraction. Or at least I thought so. Then came the whispers. Ah, it started innocently enough, a wine night with friends, a little too much Pinot, and the kind of uninhibited girl talk that skims the line between camaraderie and oversharing. Oh, come on, Emma. You've never wondered? My friend Carla asked, a sly grin spreading across her face. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. I mean, size has to matter at least a little, right? The group erupted into giggles, but I felt a pang of discomfort. I don't think it does, I said, shrugging. If the connection is there, everything else falls into place. Carla rolled her eyes dramatically, spoken like someone who's never been with a man who's truly gifted. um, the conversation moved on, but Carla's words stayed with me like a pebble in my shoe. I couldn't shake them no matter how much I tried. Was there something I was missing? I'd never thought of David's average size as a problem because it had never been a question. Now it was a whisper in the back of my mind that grew louder with each passing day. I told myself it was ridiculous. What did it matter? David and I had built a life together, a good one. But those whispers from friends, from articles online, from the snippets of TV shows I'd catch while folding laundry kept coming. They wove themselves into the fabric of my thoughts, subtle but insistent. Was I missing out on something better? Something more? David didn't notice the change in me at first. Why would he? He was his usual self, sweet and steady, but I began to pull away in small ways. Conversations that had once flowed easily now felt stilted. Our intimacy, already routine, started to feel like a chore. I hated myself for it, for letting these whispers poison something that had been perfectly fine. But once the seed is planted, it's hard to stop it from growing. Looking back, I wonder if there was a part of me that wanted to be tempted, a part that was curious to see if the whispers were true. Um, at the time, I convinced myself it was harmless, just thoughts, nothing more. But thoughts have a way of shaping actions if left unchecked. And that's where my story begins, with a whisper, a doubt, and a seed of curiosity that would grow into something I could never have imagined. If you've ever found yourself questioning the things you thought were certain, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that dig into the complexities of life. Sometimes the things we don't want to face are the ones we need to confront the most. Curiosity is a funny thing. It starts as a harmless itch, a passing thought that you can't quite shake. But the more you try to ignore it, the stronger it becomes, until suddenly it's all you can think about. That's how it was for me. Those whispers from that wine night had planted a seed. And now it was growing roots deep into my mind. I started noticing things about David that I never had before. The way he'd always settle for routine, the same meals, the same date nights, the same positions. It was comforting once, but now it felt suffocating. I began to wonder if my discontent had always been there, buried beneath layers of familiarity and habit. Or had the whispers simply unearthed something I wasn't ready to face? I didn't want to talk to him about it. How could I? How do you tell your husband that you've started questioning his adequacy because of idle chatter from your friends? Instead, I turned to the internet. Late at night, when David was asleep beside me, I'd scroll through forums and articles, typing in questions I was too ashamed to say out loud. Does size matter? Can a good marriage survive sexual dissatisfaction? What does it mean to feel unfulfilled in bed? The answers were a mixed bag. Some people claimed it didn't matter at all, that emotional intimacy was the key to a happy marriage. Others argued the opposite, that physical compatibility was just as important as emotional connection. But the ones that stuck with me were the stories from women who had taken the plunge, so to speak. Their accounts were vivid, detailed, and I hated myself for reading them, for letting them fuel my already restless mind. But I couldn't stop. It was like opening a forbidden door and peeking through, knowing full well that once you've seen what's on the other side, you can't unsee it. My friends didn't help matters. Carla, especially, seemed to relish my newfound curiosity. There's no harm in exploring, she said one afternoon over coffee. Plenty of women do it. It's not about betraying your husband. It's about finding yourself. I'm not looking for an affair, Carla, I said sharply. Of course not, she replied, her tone dripping with feigned innocence. But there's no shame in wondering. You deserve to feel alive, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her words stuck with me, so alive. Wasn't that what I wanted? I'd spent so long being content, but when was the last time I'd felt truly alive? The doubt began to seep into every corner of my life. I noticed it when David kissed me goodbye in the mornings, his lips warm but perfunctory. I felt it during our date nights, where the conversation flowed but the spark felt dim. Even in bed, where his touch, once so reassuring, now felt mechanical, as though we were going through the motions of something we'd both quietly given up on. I knew I was being unfair. David hadn't changed. I had. And that realization only made the guilt heavier. I tried to bury it, to focus on the good things in our life. but the whispers were always there, growing louder, pulling me further from the woman I used to be. One evening, as David sat on the couch watching a game, I found myself staring at him. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm brewing inside me. For a moment, I thought about telling him everything about the doubts, the whispers, the restlessness I couldn't seem to shake. But the words caught in my throat. What good would it do? It wasn't his fault. This was my battle to fight, my burden to bear. Instead, I smiled and asked if he wanted another beer. He looked up, surprised but grateful, and nodded. Huh. Thanks, you're the best, he said, his voice warm with affection. Ah, I hated how much those words stung. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know where it would lead, but I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between the life I had and the life I was beginning to wonder if I could have. They say temptation often comes disguised as something harmless. That's how it was with Jake. At first, he was just a name in an email, a colleague from another branch I'd never met. We were paired together on a new project, something about restructuring workflows, though I couldn't care less about the specifics. What mattered was the spark. It began innocently. Our emails were professional, our calls polite, but there was something about his voice, deep, confident, laced with a casual charm that made me smile in a way I hadn't in a long time. I told myself it was nothing, just a little exterior Hermosa meeting. Anyway, but when the project required an in-person meeting, I couldn't ignore the flutter of nerves as I packed my suitcase. The conference was held in a sleek downtown hotel, the kind with marble floors and chandeliers that made you feel important just walking through the lobby. I checked in, trying not to dwell on the fact that David had barely looked up from his laptop when I kissed him goodbye that morning. Jake arrived late, breezing into the meeting room with an air of confidence that turned heads. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that seemed to know secrets you'd want to uncover. When he introduced himself, his handshake lingered just a fraction too long, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my pulse quicken. Over the next few days, we worked together closely. Jake was smart, quick-witted, and effortlessly charming. He had a way of making me laugh that felt different, lighter, freer. We'd grab lunch between sessions, our conversations straying far from work. He'd tell me about his travels, his adventures, and the women who couldn't keep up with him. What about you, Emma? He asked one evening over drinks at the hotel bar. What's your story? Oh. um, you know, married, suburban, pretty boring, I said with a self-deprecating laugh. Jake's brow furrowed, his gaze sharpening. Boring? I find that hard to believe. I shrugged, feeling both flattered and exposed under his scrutiny. It's not a bad life, just predictable. Predictability has its place, he said, leaning closer. But sometimes you've got to shake things up, take a risk. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I should have walked away then. Instead, I stayed. When his knee brushed mine under the table, I didn't move. When he suggested another round of drinks, I agreed. And when he leaned in, his hand lightly grazing my arm, I didn't stop him. That night, in the privacy of his hotel room, I crossed a line I'd told myself I never would. It wasn't planned, and yet it felt inevitable. Jake was everything David wasn't: bold, intense, unapologetically confident. The whispers in my mind, the doubts that had festered for months, seemed to melt away in his embrace. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I got to spend time with him. The aftermath was a tangle of emotions I couldn't untangle. Guilt gnawed at me, but so did something else. Relief, satisfaction. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a mistake I'd never repeat. But as I lay awake in my hotel room staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying every moment, every touch, every whisper. Jake didn't seem to share my turmoil. The next day, he acted as if nothing had happened, flashing that easy grin and focusing on the task at hand. Part of me resented him for it. Another part envied him. As the conference wrapped up, he pulled me aside. "You're something special, Emma," he said, his voice low. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." I nodded, unable to speak. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me to return to my predictable life as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, and now I had to figure out how to live with it. Back home, everything felt different. The familiarity of my routine, once so comforting, now seemed like a cage. Every glance David gave me, every smile, every touch, all of it felt heavier, laden with the weight of my secret. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and the guilt wrapped itself around me like a shroud. But it wasn't just guilt, there was something else too. A lingering memory of Jake's touch, of his words, of how alive I had felt in those moments. I hated myself for it, for the way my mind would wander back to him when I was supposed to be focusing on David, on us. It was as though I'd opened a door I couldn't close, and now everything on the other side was spilling into my life. David didn't notice at first. He was his usual self, steady, reliable, loving. But the cracks in my facade began to show. I grew distant, distracted. When he kissed me, I'd stiffen. When he tried to talk about his day, I'd zone out. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the unspoken question he was too afraid to ask. "What's wrong?" David said when he tried to talk to me. "Is it me?" I sighed. I told myself I could fix it, that if I just tried harder, if I buried the memories deep enough, I could go back to the way things were. But the harder I tried, the more it slipped away. The intimacy we'd once shared now felt like a performance. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered "I love you" felt like a lie. One night, as we lay in bed, David reached for me. His touch was gentle, familiar, but it sent a jolt of panic through me. I turned away, mumbling something about being tired. He didn't push, but I could feel the hurt radiating from him. "Emma?" he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "Is everything okay? You've been so distant lately." Did I do something wrong? The question cut through me like a knife. I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the weight I'd been carrying. But how could I? How do you confess to the person who loves you most that you've betrayed them in the worst possible way? Um, yeah, no, it's not you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I've just been stressed. Work, life, you know how it is. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe me. I'm here for you, Emma. Whatever you need. Mm. His words only made the guilt worse. Here he was, trying to be supportive while I was keeping a secret that could destroy everything we'd built together. I wanted to cry, to scream, to tell him everything. But instead, I just nodded and rolled over, pretending to fall asleep. The days turned into weeks, and the distance between us grew. I threw myself into work, using it as an excuse to avoid confronting the mess I'd made of my life. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories of Jake lingered, haunting me like a ghost. I thought about reaching out to him, about finding some way to recapture that feeling of being alive. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. Jake wasn't the answer. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, one I couldn't ignore any longer. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, David came into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, um, watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Um, Emma, he said finally, I feel like I'm losing you. I don't know what's going on, but I can't keep pretending everything's okay. Really? His words broke something inside me. I turned to him, tears streaming down my face. David, I need to tell you something. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The truth was out there, hanging in the air between us. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much damage it caused, I owed him that much. David stared at me, his eyes searching mine for answers. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the words. How could I explain the unexplainable? How could I make him understand when I barely understood it myself? I made a mistake, I said, my voice trembling. A terrible mistake. His face fell, and for a moment I thought he might not respond, but then he spoke, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. What kind of mistake, Emma? The weight of my guilt was crushing. I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. I was unfaithful, I whispered. It happened once and I regret it more than anything. The silence that followed was unbearable. When I finally gathered the courage to look at him, I saw the pain etched across his face. His shoulders slumped, and he exhaled a shaky breath. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do this to us? Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain. I don't know, I said, my voice cracking. I was confused, restless. I started questioning things I never thought about before. And then Jake happened. It wasn't planned, David. I didn't mean for any of it to happen. He flinched at the mention of Jake's name, and I realized too late that I should have kept that detail to myself. But there was no taking it back now. The truth was out, and there was no way to soften the blow. So it was him, David said bitterly. The guy from the conference. I nodded, my stomach churning with shame. It was a mistake, I repeated. I'm so sorry, David. I never wanted to hurt you. He shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Do you even understand what you've done? He asked, his voice rising. You've destroyed everything we've built together. How am I supposed to trust you after this? I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, I said desperately. Please, David, I love you. I love us. Don't let this ruin everything. But my words felt hollow even to me. How could I expect him to forgive me when I could barely forgive myself? David stood and began pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. I need time, he said finally. Time to think. Time to figure out if we can even come back from this. I nodded, though the thought of him walking away filled me with dread. Take all the time you need, I said. Just, please don't give up on us. He didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his keys and left, the door slamming shut behind him. I stood there, alone in the silence, the reality of what I'd done crashing down around me. The days that followed were the longest of my life. David stayed at a friend's place, leaving me to navigate the emptiness of our home. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the crushing weight of my guilt. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the memories of Jake, of David, of the moment I'd let everything slip away to get. When David finally returned, he looked exhausted, as though he'd aged years in just a few days. He sat me down at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable. He said, I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry I let you down. I've thought about this a lot, he began, his voice steady but strained. And I've decided I'm willing to try to work through this, but it's going to take time, Emma. A lot of time. And things are never going to be the same. Relief and sorrow washed over me in equal measure. I'll do whatever it takes, I said, my voice trembling. I'll go to therapy. We can go to therapy. Whatever you need, David, I'll do it. He nodded, though his expression remained guarded. This isn't just about what I need. It's about us. If we're going to rebuild this marriage, it has to be a partnership, and it's going to take a lot of work. I understand, I said, and I'm ready to do the work. I'm ready to fight for us. David sighed, his shoulders sagging. I hope you mean that, Emma, because if this ever happens again, there won't be a second chance. It won't, I said, my voice firm. I swear to you, it won't. Basie pauses. For effect, a wash of relief immediately seizing her, raising some puzzlement and questions. He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for a shred of the woman he'd once trusted implicitly. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said. We'll try. As he stood to leave the room, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. We had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other.